So once again, welcome to church today. Joint services between the two we ordinarily have. And this is a great text and a great time for us to be together, because we hear today the stories of how some of the disciples were called to be followers of Jesus. Turns out there are two sets of brothers in this story. Andrew, for whom our church is named, and Peter, his brother, who gets more press than Andrew. And then James and John, the sons of Zebedee. All of them, it seems they were fishermen who were just doing their job on the Lake of Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Galilee, when Jesus passed by and asked them if they would accept his invitation to follow him and take a new step in their life and take a big turn so that they would actually go a different direction. And from that day on, their lives definitely went in new directions. What's fascinating, though, about these people, I mean the two sets of brothers, they seem utterly and completely ordinary. I mean, regular people. Ordinary people. People who are just doing their job that they've probably done for years and years, and their family for years and years before them, and generations as fishermen. So some of them are in the boat fixing the net. The others are throwing the net out in the water to catch some fish. That's what they do. But they're just regular, ordinary, common people. It seems as if there is no great prerequisite for being a follower or disciple. That you don't have to be special to be a disciple. And they turned out to be huge disciples. They became apostles. But they started off just ordinary, regular, common folk. And if you look at most of the stories about them and how they went about the rest of their time with Jesus, they ran into a lot of problems along the way. They weren't the smartest tools in the shed. They misunderstood, like every other parable Jesus would tell them. He would tell them a parable, and he'd have to correct them all the time. So, no, really, you didn't quite get that one. Let me come over here, I'll explain it to you. And sometimes they were full of ego and full of pride. Do you remember the story when it says they were walking along the road and they were kind of discussing among them who was the greatest and who would be the most important disciple and who would really be Jesus' special friend? And Jesus said, look, you guys don't really understand the whole discipleship thing. It's about, well, just come follow me. I'll explain to you as we go. And sometimes they were not the most courageous people either. They didn't have extra amounts of courage. There was the time when Peter is called to step out on the water, and he's all afraid. That was not a highlight for Peter's life. And then there was, of course, a time in the garden when they all kind of checked out, when he was under the most pressure. There was a time when Peter ends up in the courtyard, when Jesus is going through the beginnings of the trials at the end of his life. I mean, the legal trials, religious trials, and Peter denies him, says, no, I don't know who that is. So courage was not always the hallmark of the disciples. They really were ordinary, regular, common people. There's also the time when they're not full of faith. They were not the most, trusting and non-anxious, and we know you can do this, Jesus. Not really so much. There was a time when Jesus had all his people in front of him, and he wanted to feed them, and they didn't have enough stuff. They only had 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, and Jesus says, well, you feed them, and they look at each other and says, I'm not sure what he's talking about here, but it has nothing to do with us. But he says, oh, you of little faith, give me the bread and the loaves and watch how this goes. Just ordinary folks, just brothers doing their job out by the sea, casting their nets. and doing their fishing. Not the most faithful, not the most courageous, not always the most spiritually adept. One thing they did have, though, one thing they did have, and you can tell this by the way they responded to Jesus, they did have a lot of heart. You know, when you look at all those stories about Jesus and about the disciples and all the trouble they got into, you got to wonder if sometimes Jesus didn't think to himself, you know, maybe I should have chosen more carefully. Maybe I should have had a prerequisite. But in the end, Jesus said, no, these 4 people and the 12 I will choose, they will do just fine. They are just what I need because they have a lot of heart. When he calls, they say, I'll follow you. When he calls, they answer immediately. When he calls, they stop what they're doing, take great risk, leave a lot of things behind, and they follow. And they show great heart and great urgency and great commitment to this Jesus. So of all the things they were lacking, which were many, the one thing they needed and the one thing they had was great heart. And they followed immediately. When you look at the people next to you in the pew now, some people who you don't usually see, or when you look at yourself, or when you look at the clergy who work in the church and the bishops, and you know they're disciples, don't sometimes you think to yourself, when you look at the folks around you, or you look at yourself and you want to ask God, and you want to say, really? Couldn't you have chosen a little better? Certainly there must be a prerequisite for this community. But apparently not. When Jesus calls you and me to be disciples, we didn't have to be the smartest, or the most courageous, or the most faithful, or anything else. When he calls you and he calls me, he just asks for us to come follow. Have some heart. No prerequisites. Just come follow me. Have some heart. And we're going to work out the rest as we go. That's really good news. For those of us, me and you and the people you know in church and out of the church, who are disciples of Jesus, all he asks is that you come and follow. Come and follow. Have a little heart. And we'll work out the rest along the way.